Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at OneElect, and today we're going to be looking at MSAL with a single page application and how you can use this to access APIs on Azure so that you don't have to use some kind of intermediate web server to call these services directly from something like a single page application. Like I say, I'm going to do a brief run through of the MSAL library on Azure. The reason I want to do this is because the MSAL library provides an interesting dynamic for developing applications inside of a browser. So historically in the past, a lot of times to hit resources on Azure, you needed to go through some kind of API, typically provided by a web service that might be hosted on something like Azure App Services or something like that. But in recent years, more and more of the services on Azure allow you to do authentication against Azure AD and then get access tokens to hit those resources directly using an access token rather than using something like a shared access token. So what this allows us to do is write browser-based applications that can hit Azure resources directly through SDKs in a browser context. So this opens up a lot of possibilities for the kinds of applications that you can write against Azure without having to go through a server-side API to access those backend resources. So what I'm going to do today is show you how to hook this up to a application that is running in a browser that's going to be hitting storage queues and also be hitting Azure Blob Storage. But the same principles would apply for most anything that enables you to use a browser to hit a specific Azure resource. And this one is fairly popular because it is used a lot in the context of the kind of applications that we've been talking about on Azure, which are static web apps. What this allows us to do is interact with blob storage in a way that allows us to build highly scalable applications without the complexities of having to have a lot of complex infrastructure to support that. So this will open up some possibilities, maybe get you thinking about maybe some ways you can re-engineer your applications for running on Azure. So here's the flow of how it works. So this is my service right here. Could be any kind of service that uses Azure AD, and then this, of course, is going to be Azure AD right here. And this is my client, my laptop, my phone, whatever it is that's going to be running the web app that I'm going to be running. So the first thing that happens is an initial request to the service. So that could be downloading some static content, a web app of some kind, but that's usually going to be an unauthenticated request. So it's going to download the initial web page, whatever it might be, from a particular host. Now that host is going to have, as part of it, a lot of other features associated with it, but we're primarily concerned with that first initial unauthenticated request. That's basically just downloading the original HTML files and then rendering those in a browser. Now, depending on how this is set up, it will either automatically redirect or you might have to click an explicit login button. But what it will do is it will redirect the browser over to Azure AD to log on. So basically that's going to go pull up a authentication screen. So that could be a username and password, multi-factor authentication, whatever it may be, depending on how Azure AD is configured. You're going to go through a logon process or an authentication process. Now, if you're already logged in, sometimes it'll just kind of skip past that and automatically redirect you. But once you're authenticated, or if you're already authenticated, what you're going to get back from that is a redirect back to the browser or some kind of code that is going to be given back to the browser. And that code is a code that authenticates the user that can then be exchanged for an access token. Now, the access token is the piece of information that you need to access resources on the service. The access token contains things that are relevant to the specific app that you're working with. These are called claims. And this could be things like the user ID, and it also contains things like scope, which tells the application what level of access it's actually asking for. And depending on the level of access granted to the user depends on if they're going to be able to use the access token within the context of the service. Now, once you get that, you request that code, you get back an access token, and then you can request a service with that access token. And then what the service is going to do is it's going to validate the token. Now, that can be done in any number of ways. One common way is to actually go to Azure AD and validate the token. Another one is to look at the signature on it using a certificate. The way that this is generally going to work is it's just going to validate the token against Azure AD using the client libraries that are available inside the service. But that's all done behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about setting that all up, considering that you're hitting a first-party service using Azure AD, in this case, Azure Blob Storage or Azure Storage Queues or something like that. Once the token is validated and the service then vindicates that this particular user is authorized to access whatever resource they're going to be accessing, then it will actually return whatever request is being made back to the browser. So maybe it's a request for a blob, or maybe it's a request to write a blob. If the permissions are set in such a way that you can do that, then you should be able to access the resource, or you'll get back an error code if you're not authorized to do that. So there's kind of two parts of this, and that's authentication, which is the part of the process where they validate you are who you say you are. Then there's the second part, which is authorization, which is ensuring that you have the appropriate permissions to access whatever resource it is you're trying to access. And once you're granted access to it, you can then download, upload, whatever it is that you're trying to do within the context of that given service. So there's a couple of things that we need to do to get started with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a storage account. So this is what we're going to be using for our application, our sample application anyway. So I'm going to type in storage account and create one of these, and this is just a standard storage account. I'm not going to do anything particularly fancy here. I'm just going to create a empty let's get a storage MSAL demo, and then I'll just call it MSAL demo or something like that. Let's see if it takes 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I like that one. And I can use standard and local redundant storage. This is because I'm not really going to keep this around for a while. And yeah, I can probably pretty much take the defaults on most of this. And make sure you can turn on tables and queues right here, since I think this does use queues, the application that I'm going to install. And then we're going to say public endpoints, it's fine, and I don't need the data protection per se, but if you want to turn that on, that'd be fine too. And click next and go ahead and create this, and that will start the process of creating the application space that we're going to be using for our particular service. So we'll come back when that's done. Now I'm in the storage account, and the first thing I need to do with the storage account is get the static website set up that I'm going to be using for this particular demo. So this actually uses a static web app to host the site, and this is important because what this is going to allow us to do is to use the static web app that I'm installing on this for the application host. So that gives me an endpoint, and I'm going to need this endpoint to set up Azure Active Directory. So I'm doing this first. So I'm going to go ahead and get this endpoint, and then we're going to go over to Azure Active Directory and set up the application in Azure Active Directory so that we can configure our client. Okay, now that I have the storage account set up, I'm going to come back over here to Azure Active Directory, and I'm actually going to create an application here under app registrations. So this allows me to create a new app registration for the actual APIs to use to authenticate with. So to do this, I have to get that URL for the static website, and so that's where I'm going to be using this URL that I grabbed already. And so I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to create a new application that's called MSAL demo or something like that, and that's going to create a user-facing website. And so what I need to do then is select the appropriate kind of application. I'm going to use single page application. Now, a single page application is still a web app, but it's using everything client side. So it's not going to be calling back through it might call it back through a backend server to access this, but the nature of the single page application here means that it will allow me to get access tokens for the single page application without the need of a additional server to be involved in it, and allow me to authenticate directly and then do the exchange accordingly. So I'm going to use that URI right there for it. And I'm going to then register this particular application. Now I need to configure my code. So let's go over and configure the code real quick. Okay, there's one more thing that we need to do inside of our app registration here, and that is to set the API permissions right here. So we're going to go over here to API permissions, and we're going to click on, it's already set up for user read, but we need to add a permission. So we can just use Microsoft APIs. We're not writing our own APIs here. We're using first-party services. We're going to click on Azure Storage, and then we need to do user impersonation and just click add permission right here for delegated permissions. So once that has been set, it doesn't require admin consent or anything like that. Then you should be able to log into the application. So the user consent will be available to that, and that will be enable this application to access Azure Storage on the user's behalf. So I'm here in the code and I want to configure this to use the properties from the application I just registered. So first thing I need to do is obviously have a reference to the JavaScript library. The rest of this stuff is specific to my application. So I'm using a Bootstrap based application. There's really no other libraries in this. I'm just using the MSAL library, and so it's pretty much just that. I guess it's got some jQuery that's needed for Bootstrap to run, but I'm not using jQuery. I'm just pretty much using straight JavaScript for this particular demonstration. And the pieces that I'm mostly concerned with are these right here. And so I have the client ID authority and redirect URI, which I need to populate right here. I've actually already populated that with that URI endpoint that I'm going to be using as part of my static website. So that's the redirect URI that the application is expecting. Now this API route is the API route for the blob storage SDKs, blob storage APIs I'm going to be calling inside of this. So it's not the same as this. So this is completely different. We'll configure that in a moment, even though it's the same storage account. So this has a different URI than the actual APIs do. So don't get those confused. That could be a little confusing in the context of this demo. But this is what I need to put in the app registration, and this is what I need to call when I actually call the APIs from this application. So the thing I need from Azure AD is the information for the client ID as well as the authority. The client ID is inside of this application right here. So I'm going to grab that and I can then paste it right here. It's just the application or client ID, and then the authority is just the tenant ID right here, or directory ID as it's sometimes called. And you can use this URL, then supply your tenant ID after that. Mine won't change since I've used this before. But that's what you need to configure the MSAL library. And that's just basically setting up the actual authorities and the properties needed by MSAL to connect. Now, these are defaults that I've taken for this. It's using a cache, a local cache or session storage for this, and it's just using the local logger for logging on this. So that's again not anything particular that you have to worry about for this to work. The only other thing that you have to set then is scope, and the scope is basically user impersonation. And so this is basically going to set up a trust relationship between the login and the application. So whenever you log into this application for the first time, it's going to ask you, do you want to allow this application to have access to your profile? And then it will say yes or no. If you grant it access, then the application will work and it will just impersonate you. It's not impersonating you per se, but it's using your identity to access the APIs in that context. And so everything else is done using APIs available in a browser. This is XHR or XML HTTP request right here. That's an older API. There's newer ones like request. If you want to use jQuery, you can do that. Or if you want to use some framework, that's fine too. But that's not really the point. The main thing that you need to note here is that you need to set up the bearer token with the access token. So once the login is called, this will actually get populated. And I'll show you that code in a minute. And then you set an HTTP header authorization bearer, and so that's going to present an access token back with the API. And these are specific to the storage API. That's not something that you have to worry about. That's just something that you have to look at the documentation for the API for. But the rest of this is just framing up the authentication and then the request for whatever it might be. Now, the real magic of this happens on this login function right here. Now, I've got this set up to where when the page loads, it'll call this login function right here. And it calls out to a pop-up version of the login. So it's going to ask me, do you, if you have pop-ups blocked, it won't work, but you can reload the page and enable the pop-up and then reload the page and it should work. In any case, for this particular instance, and it's going to authenticate the user through a pop-up, and then after that pop-up authenticates, it's going to redirect back to this with a request. a response, and then it's going to do an exchange of that code for an access token. And that's what this is right here. And the container is just the blob storage container, and this is just getting data from it. So again, just something very straightforward here. Once you get that, then you can make the requests, and then this is the logic of some of the logic in the application. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward implementation. In any case, I'll post this code to GitHub so you can see what's going on exactly. But I'm not using any libraries. I'm just using APIs built right into the browser. And so if this works, I should be able to upload this to the static website. But first, we need to configure the storage account, which I'm going to show you how to do next. So I'm here in the Azure portal, and I have my storage account. This is my Azure Active Directory for reference. This is my storage account, and I need to configure this guy to use the storage account application that I set up over here. Now, I already set up that inside of the code. So now I need to configure the permissions inside of the storage account so that the APIs will authorize the use of whoever's logging in. So the way to do that is to set up your containers. Now, I already have the container web set up. For this particular application, it's mostly going to be looking inside of a container that is bound to the user. And the user in this case is going to have their own container. I think that's what this code is doing. So basically, whenever I go down here to get the images for this, the images are looking inside of images inside of a particular container that is going to be a part of the API that I'm calling. So if I come up here to the XHR request, that is this get data, it's going to build out a URL that is the API root, the container, and the query. And the container itself right here is something that was defined whenever the login did. So it's based on the login of whoever it might be. So it's basically replacing the principal name that is typically an email address coming out of the Azure Active Directory with a dash, and it's also replacing the period with a dash. So if my email address is something like this, me@blaze.net, it's expecting there to be a container blaze-net for the actual implementation of that. So that's what this code right here is doing, replacing the ampersands and dots with dashes. So that is the expected container name. So that's what I'm going to go over here and do. So back inside of the browser here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new container called me-blaze.net, and that's the container I'm going to set the permissions on so that I can access it. So this particular container will have IAM access controls right here. So you can come into this and you can grant access for a given user. So if I click add here, I can add a role assignment to the container, and I'm going to look for owner's probably more than sufficient for a particular user. And so to do that, what I'm going to look for is the user within the context of my Azure Active Directory right here. So let's go ahead and search for that. And that's not the one I want. That's a one I set up here for a minute ago. Let's see. Let's go should be this one right here. That's the main one that I'm going to use that I log in with. So that's the principal that I'm going to log in with when I log in with this particular application. And so that one has been signed as an owner to this particular container. So whenever I log in with that, then the access token is going to request all the resources inside of this particular container with that user. And so the access token is going to be bound to that user. So given that this is an owner, that should be plenty of permissions to read, write, and change everything about this container, which is where the API is going to be calling into. So so if I click on view my access, that should show me the my access here. Or if I click on the view access requirements here, you can come down here and see that it's been added explicitly right here, but I've logged in as that already, so that should be fine for this particular resource. So that assigns the permissions. Now there's one other thing that I need to do for this though, and that is set up CORS. So CORS is the cross-origin resource sharing. And this is needed for blob storage and the queue service right here. And I'm basically just going to allow for whatever and to come into this. And cores will basically enable me to, I'll use any header, any exposed header. And this basically will allow me to do anything from any origin. And that's probably not a good thing to do. You'd want to bind this to a particular origin if you wanted to secure it. If you're exposing a more general API that you want to log in with, and it can come from multiple websites, allowing any origin might be fine. So this is just browser security stuff to enable cores around the blob storage APIs, and the same would go for the queue storage as well. So I'm gonna have to configure a queue storage for a very similar thing right here. So I can set up all of these to set up cores for blob storage and for queue service right there. So the APIs have been configured. Now I need cores enabled. So the last thing I need to do here is get my queue set up. And I don't have a queue right here. I'm basically just going to repeat what I did down, repeat what I did just a second ago. And the queue is going to be print queue, and then that is going to have this URL right here, and that's what this should match right here, queue.core.windows.net/print queue. And if I go into this, there is it's going to have the messages pre-pinned right here, post-pinned right here, and that's where it's expecting new messages to read and write from. So that's just that's a convention with the actual library, or with the queues right here. So this is what I need to configure. So I already have that set up. So if I come over here and grant access controls to this, I can assign role permissions just like I did here back when I did a user right here, add a role. And I can look for, owners, probably more than enough for this. And I can do me, and that's going to give me this principal right here. And let's save that. And if I hit roles again, you can see role assignments rather. You can see that I've explicitly added it right here. And that's how you'd want to add users into this if you're going to be adding users explicitly into the role. Now you could create roles and then use roles in this as well, and then add the role, the Azure Active Directory roles if you're using a premium tier. But this allows me to just add in a user, and then I can log in with that user. So that is pretty straightforward there. So now that I have this configured, I should be able to upload my application to the portal. Now I need to upload some data to that container right here that I haven't created. It's expecting a new set of files here, so I'm going to go ahead and upload some data to this so that I'll have some data to work with when I actually upload the application. Code's configured and the storage account is set up, and I think all the permissions have been set. So I'm going to come over here and upload a file to this. It looks like I've already uploaded it once using this one. I'm just going to click right here and upload that again. And it's going to put that file right there into this $web container. And just to show you that what I already loaded while I was offline, I uploaded some images into the images folder that the actual application is going to be interacting with, and these are the thumbnails for those images. So it's using thumbnails and images, and it should be accessing these images by way of the API once I've logged in. So let's come back over here to my static website, and let's look at this. I'm going to take this URL here and pop it up in a new incognito window. Since I'm using that pop-up interface, it's going to block it, but I'm going to allow it and then refresh. Now I should get the login for Azure AD, and I'm going to put in my email address for my principal, and it is not a MSA account, and I'm going to type in the password for that. And this is probably going to ask me, yes, stay signed in. If all goes well, it should load the images. So this is accessing the images now by way of an API, since I've set that all up. And that just basically read the blobs as a list, and then it requested each of the thumbnails from that list as blobs, and then turn them into images on the page. And if I hit show, it's basically just going to download the larger images as blobs, and then just use a blob URL inside the browser to display that. So And that's just the image itself, the raw image. So this is a working application using MSAL. So I'll upload this code to a GitHub repository. It'll be linked in the description below, and you can check this out. But hopefully this demo has showed you how you can use Active Directory and MSAL with JavaScript applications to call the APIs available to a lot of different Azure resources. Now you have to look at the documentation for each of those specific ones, but all in all, it's fairly straightforward once you get it all configured and working. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.